Hey, hello everyone. My name is Eric Masowski, and in this tutorial, we're going to be continuing the 101 series for 3D Studio Max, but taking a look at other ways that you can use splines to create objects, namely the Sweep Modifier and Lofting. So, to begin with, let's take a look at Sweep. Now, Sweep is a new addition to 3D Studio Max, which allows you to quickly create single shape extrusions along an arbitrary path. So for example here, let's just go ahead and create an arbitrary line in our top viewport. Go over to the Modify panel, click on the drop-down list, and choose Sweep. There it is. Okay, now this is really great for quickly creating piping, beams, and so on. You can see right now that I have a wide flange selected, and it just quickly did a nice extrusion along that path that I defined. You can specify the width, the thickness of the beams, the interpolation, and so on. Now you also have a list of many different types that you can choose. So an L angle, a bar, a channel, cylinder, half round, which is kind of like a hemisphere extruded, a pipe, quarter round, T, tube, and then wide flange. Now additionally with this, you can specify kind of the orientation of this shape along our path. So right now it's right in the center. We can offset it to the inside, to the outside, or anywhere in between. You can also do such things as turn on banking. In this case, it's really not going to matter since our shape was flat. But one other thing really worth noting here is that you can use a custom shape. So if, for example, I go and I just create, say, a star. And I use this as my shape. You can see it created that very quickly and very nicely. This is a very powerful tool, and I highly recommend using it whenever you can. Now, one other thing that's worth mentioning with Sweep is its ability to handle intersecting shapes cleanly. So for example, just going to go ahead and delete both of these, go back to Create, Shapes, and Rectangle. I'm going to create one rectangle, turn off Start New Shape, and then create another intersecting rectangle. Now we're going to jump back to our Modify panel, apply a Sweep Modifier, and let's take a close look at this. Okay, so currently if we take a look at the seams, you can see that we can choose between creating an actual Boolean intersection of the seams or just having the various splines intersect themselves. Now this only works for a shape that has two separate splines that intersect each other. If you drew one continuous line that happened to intersect itself, you cannot do the union intersections. Okay, so just keep that in mind if you want to use it. Now if we go ahead and we make this a little bit thicker, take a look, you can see that it creates a much nicer seam between the various parts. And so if we pay attention here to the cross section, if I turn that off, you can see they just intersect each other. So depending on what you're going for will depend on whether or not you actually want to use this. But that's basically the sweep modifier. Now let's take a look at lofting, because what if you want to have multiple shapes along this path instead of just one? Okay, so if we go over back to create shapes, we'll create first a rectangle in our top view, or a square rather. Going to create a circle, and then we'll create another rectangle. Now in our front view, we're going to create a line just right down the middle. Now this could be an arbitrary path as well, but just to keep things simple, we're just going to make it a nice straight line going up. Alright, now the way that you usually create lofts is you first select the path that you're going to be using. You go over to Create, Geometry, and from the drop-down list, choose Compound Objects. Within here at the bottom you'll see the Loft Tool. So if we click on Loft, we now have to tell 3D Studio Max what shape we want to use along this path. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose Get Shape. We're going to click on our large rectangle. Now you see that it just basically does a very simple extrude all the way up. However, we have the option of actually specifying multiple shapes along this entire path. So underneath Path Parameters, we can just increase the path increment, or the path percentage. And you'll notice this little yellow spot or cross moving up. So what we're going to do here is we're going to move up a bit, going to choose Get Shape again, and this time we're going to choose our smaller box. And so you can see how it interpolated it to that smaller box and then propagated those changes all the way out. So we can move forward a little bit more, choose Get Shape, and then send it to the circle. You can send it up a little bit more, back to the square, a little bit higher up. I'm going to choose the square again to make a little block there so that the shape is consistent from that one to that one. And so we just go all the way to the top now, and then we'll choose circle again. You can even go back down to later or an earlier point and tweak that as well. Okay, now one thing you may notice here is that there's twisting going on at the various stages, particularly going from the circle up to the square or the rectangle. The reason for this is that 3D Studio Max tries to match up the starting vertex, or the first vertex for a particular shape. So let's hide our object really quick by going over to the Display menu, clicking on Hide Selected, going to choose our circle, go over to the Modify panel, and convert this into an editable spline just by applying an Edit Spline modifier. Now if we go into vertex mode and take a quick look at the vertices for our circle, you can see where they are. Now these don't correspond to where the vertices are for our rectangles, which are over here on the corners. So what will happen is he'll first take a look at this vertex. The one with the box on it is your first vertex or the start of your shape. So take that one and you will try to match it to this one right down there. And so naturally what will happen is we'll get a twist or a stretch in the surface. So one thing that you could do is you could try to take this spline, rotate it about 45 degrees, Now when we take a look at it, it's much closer to the starting point of our other shapes. So now if we go and we unhide our shape again, now currently this is, it's not going to immediately propagate for you or change for you. So what we have to do is we actually have to rebuild this shape. So let's do that really quick. Now, actually, in addition to just rebuilding it, we could go through and modify each one of these by hand. And actually, let's just do that really quick to illustrate the point. Then we'll go through and rebuild the shape. So if we go over to the Modify panel, have our loft selected, and go down to Shape. This allows us to select the individual cross sections of our object. We can then modify them however we want. So if we rotate it 45 degrees, you'll notice that it's much cleaner. So the same here, just want to rotate it 45 degrees. We can even select one of these and adjust its position or its path level. And say we want to introduce a lot of twist, we can even do that as well. We can even rotate it arbitrarily along a different axis. And so you can use this to create some very complex shapes. Okay, now one thing to keep in mind with lofting is that if you go ahead and you take one of your shapes and say scale it down, so we now have a smaller circle to work with. Loft will not take that scaling into effect when it's building its shape. So if we go back, select our path, go to Geometry, click on Loft, get Shape, choose the large one, move our path up a bit, get Shape again, and then pick the smaller one. You can see it's the same size. The reason for this is that it actually looks at the vertex positions. So not the actual scaling or transforms of your shapes. Actually, your shapes could be completely away from your actual loft object, but it still works properly. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you want to create kind of like a duplicate of an object that's smaller, copy it, won't work. Copying and resizing it won't work. You have to operate on the actual individual indices. One quick way to do that, instead of trying to position each of the vertices roughly where you want it, what you can do is you can copy an object, so in this case our rectangle, set the new size of it using scale, rotate, whatever, then go over to your tool panel or utilities panel, which looks like a little hammer, click on reset to X form and click on reset selected. What this will do is it'll rebuild all the vertice positions based on its new scale, rotation, and transformation matrices. So now if we jump back to our loft object, go to the very top, choose Get Shape, and click on this, you can see it's now larger. Okay, so they'll basically do it for the creation of lofts. Now let's take a quick look at some of the parameters that we have when dealing with lofts. So if we take a look underneath surface parameters, we can choose whether or not we smooth the surface, the length and the width. We can apply mapping and have it adjust our tiling or our repeating. Additionally, if we take a look underneath skin parameters, we can specify how many cross sections or how many interpolation steps we use. We can also choose whether or not we're going to do it through contour or banking, but since we only chose a straight line, this really doesn't apply. We can choose just to optimize shapes as best it can, and we can choose to do linear interpolation instead of smooth interpolation. So there's a lot of options here that you can play with. Feel free to email me or post on the forums if you have any questions about them or the entire creation process. Otherwise, thanks for watching.